Thanks for having me. I'm really sorry to have missed yesterday. This meeting, wonderful meeting, got wedged into some other interesting things that were scheduled a long time ago. I'm going to talk about two things: discovering variables and how one might think of human judgment as overfitting of ML. Okay, so a now standard and useful definition of behavioral economics is that we're trying to include natural limits. Natural is my way to prime you to think about biology as well as psychology, of computation, willpower, and selfishness into models of individual level choice, and of course aggregation and response to incentive institutions scales up from there. One way to narrow this definition that we sometimes use is to say we borrow from neighboring sciences. So psychophysics is important in thinking about prospect theory and contrast effects and other stuff. People have been interested in norms. Sociality ideas come often from social psych and a little bit from anthropology. Neuroscience has contributed and so on. But even more general way to think of it is a narrow view of neoclassical economics is that there's only a small number of variables which are reliably likely to influence choice, or which we use in our models as the main drivers of predictions about what influences choice, which is preferences and things that may change preferences, information and constraints, as well as, say, institutions' incentives and how they influence those three. And in behavioral economics is just more open-minded. So people have said in the past, sometimes to a fault, because behavioral economics is not meant to be a list of effects. It is meant to be a list of effects which are then constantly consolidated and kind of dimension reduced into more basic principles. So here are some of the things some of you will know a little bit about. So we're interested in things like reminders in the reduced form, even absent of full theory of attention. Social comparison, cognitive skill is something people have been interested, like the cognitive reflection test, which Danny's collaborator Shane Frederick put together, anxiety and habit. And nudge experiments also, those of you who have been following this will know, have been kind of exploring this space of different things that may matter, sometimes kind of atheoretically. Okay, so here comes machine learning. So what machine learning can do for behavioral economics is to allow exploration of lots of variables. There's no penalty other than what's built into through regularization and so forth to just putting all kinds of things into the machine and seeing what predicts. So I'll talk about how we can do two things this way. One is it can give an upper bound to how a theory could do. That is, if you use lots and lots of variables and we focus on a theory that uses one or just two or three, how much are we missing? How much extra headroom is there to ceiling? And so John Kleinberg and Sendel, Mullnathan, and others have written about what they call completeness, and we used the earlier term clairvoyant. And the second is we can discover some new variables. So let me show two examples, both from game theory. So this is an early example of ours in Quarterly Journal of Economics. Everybody except for Ed Glaser, happily, and some referees didn't like this idea, but it's basically the same idea of completeness. So here's the idea: is that we have subjects play actual games and they earn a certain amount of money. And then you can ask, if you had a theory playing games in lieu of the subjects, how much could that earn? And it's similar to, it's a different question than saying, can you predict the statistical distribution of play? It's saying, how well do you predict the statistical distribution of play times the payoffs that result? For example, in some games like mixed strategy games, you might predict a little bit better in the distribution, but it's not going to have much payoff consequences, right? So it's the economic value add. It's not the statistical. It's not delta R squared. It's delta dollars. And so anyway, so we crunch some numbers, and if you compute the maximum of the economic value achieved and the maximum achievable value, if you kind of clairvoyantly knew what all the subjects were going to do in the aggregate, you can see, for example, Nash equilibrium does add some value, but sometimes it actually is worse. It's worse than the average subject. And cognitive hierarchy, which is a model we'll talk about more in a minute, gets about a third or half of the economic value. Now that means that there's more work to do, that there's some of it's sampling error, but there are things subjects are doing that the theory is not incorporating. Okay. So I'm going to turn to an example, since time is scarce, by Fuderberg and Liang, which just came out recently. They're interested in, and Kevin Leighton Brown also has worked on this in a somewhat different way, in the following question. Here, this is a canonical diagram that they use in their instructions to the players in new data collection of a 3x3 two-person matrix game. Okay. And so the question is, how well can we predict what an individual people will do in a series of these games, all of which have slightly different payoffs? But they're within a somewhat narrow structure, 3x3, two-player simultaneous move, complete information games. Okay. And so one theory is a theory of ours called Poisson CH, and basically the idea is that if you can quickly parse this math, or hopefully you may have heard of it, the idea is that a player at level k thinks about what players at level 0, 1, 2, up to k minus 1 will do, and best responds to them. And then one of the important things in the theory is what's the distribution of these level types, and we propose the Poisson distribution, which has a nice, elegant one-parameter form. The mean is equal to the variance tau. And so if you know tau, you can make an exact prediction about what might happen in these types of games. And tau typically is kind of somewhere around 1 or 1.5, although we don't expect it necessarily to be a universal constant. It could vary across games in some predictable way, sure. Okay. And what Fudenberg and Liang did was to take a machine learning view, and again, following KLB and James Wright, which was to say, in this class of 3x3 games, for each action, you can define it as having lots of features. It could be top, middle, bottom. It could be, it has the maximum of the maximum payoffs. It could maximize the total payoffs. That's what we call level 1. You just look and say, I don't know, no idea what happens, what row has the highest total payoffs. You could max them in and so forth. So they lay out 88 of these features. And so they're considering a very kind of promiscuous anything goes theory. People may be using any combination of these 88 features. Okay. And so then they had a lot of extant data from previous studies, and then they collected a bunch of new data, and they built they did a couple approaches, but I'll just focus on decision trees. So they built these decision trees. So for example, this is a decision tree with 2 splits, or they call dependencies. In this case, you say action A1 is not a best response to uniform. If that's the case, is action 3 not a best response? Is action 3 a best response? And the tree tells you what to do. So this is a very simple tree that just uses best response to uniform as the driving feature. Okay. And so you can see the prediction error drops dramatically from number dependence is 1, which is just one feature, to 2. And then it gradually kind of levels off, and you're not really getting much more descriptive power out of trees that go from depth 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is quite typical, I think, in tree and forest literature. Okay. And so then what they do is they can define error, so that these forests of these trees make predictions about distributions, and then you can see how off they are. A naive benchmark, which is uniform randomization across all 3 strategies, we'll call that 0. And the best possible, which is this clairvoyant, what did people actually do if we had guessed correctly, is 1. And so a uniform Nash is a third. So Nash equilibrium does have some substantial predictive power, actually, right? The Poisson cognitive hierarchy does 82%, which we're quite thrilled by, to be honest. And a prediction rule based on game features does even a little better, almost perfect. So combining, and this is all cross-validated out of sample, right? So it's not overfitting. So these features are capturing almost all there is to be able to say about what people choose in this narrow domain. And you also can then go back and ask, what are some missing ingredients? Like, what if we put in risk aversion? That does a little bit better. Unrestricted decision trees is 95.88. That's what we saw before. If you just restricted decision trees with 5 splits, you can do almost as well. Okay. So this is asking a slightly different question than we normally ask, which is for a typical model, what is the R squared or fit and properties of that fit, and where are the weak spots? It's asking what's the best we can do and kind of incrementally comparing. Okay, second example. This is something which is coming out soon in press. So we were interested in semi-structured bargaining. Semi-structured means there's 2 pieces of structure. There's a time deadline. They have 12 seconds to bargain. And there's an incomplete information, one side incomplete information structure where one person knows how much there is to bargain over. It's $1, $2, 3, 4, 5, $6. And the second person doesn't know, but they know what the first person knows. So the whole thing is a common prior, blah, blah, blah. And so the way the bargaining actually works is that they have this offer line, and this is how much the uninformed player is going to get out of whatever is available. Okay? And so these are screenshots. This is what the informed player sees. First, they see the pie size. If you're uninformed, you don't see that. You don't see that. And they put their initial offer at 2. The other player, in the first 2 seconds, they make an initial offer by placing a cursor. The other player says, oh, I demand 3. That's what they almost always demand, the half of the highest pie. And then over time, they move these cursors back and forth, and if they match, they see a little green line, and if that holds for 1 second, then a deal has taken place. Okay. And then they get feedback, all right. And so we got interested in this because there were quite a few experiments on this type of structure in the 1980s and 90s, discovering deadline effects and focality and different things. And then when there was kind of a big boom in non-cooperative game theory from Rubinstein, Stahl, and others, the experimental literature shifted almost entirely in that direction. And if you ask people at that time, why aren't you studying these more free-form, interesting things which are much more lifelike, which don't have so much constraint, they would say, well, we don't really have game theory that tells us what will happen. Okay, but we have machine learning. And so game theory does tell you something. If you use the revelation principle and impose some other assumptions, it tells us, it actually makes very sharp predictions for the deal rates for different pie sizes. So some of you will know this well. If, for example, you have to have a lot of strikes when the pie is small in order to satisfy the incentive compatibility constraint for when the pie is really high. And specifically, you should have 40% strikes, 60, 80, and 100. You should have 100 deals, rather. You should have no strikes up here. And as you can see, these are data. The monotonicity is pretty good, but they're not nearly as sharp. They're leaving a lot of money on the table. They're not making as many deals as the theory predicts. And there's a little bit of learning over time, but not too much. And so the question we now approach is, can we predict on a trial-by-trial basis when there's disagreements or not? This is one type of prediction, and it's pretty good. It's pretty good. But there's room for improvement. And so what we do is to use, remember, we measure the cursor location every 5 milliseconds or something. And so we have a time series in a particular trial is going to be a pair of cursor locations that are constantly moving around. So you can define tons of features, which is how far apart are they, where is the offer and where is the demand, when is the last time somebody conceded, how many times has somebody conceded, interactions among all these things. So you can define all these features of process. And you can go further. In new work we have, which is coming along, we record pupil dilation. Danny, it turns out some of you know, was seminal in introducing pupil dilation as a measure of cognitive difficulty. And facial emotion, you can ask people questions. You can measure all kinds of things, right? And so because machine learning regularizes, if we have faith in it, which I do, we can measure anything, right? And see if we can predict disagreements better. Okay, and so this is a ROC curve. Basically, a true positive means we predict a disagreement and there's a disagreement. False positive means we predict a disagreement and we're wrong. And so the ROC curve, basically, if you use just the pie size, that essentially corresponds to the histogram I showed you. You can do pretty well. You can do better than chance. If you use the process data, machine learned and cross-validated, you can do about as well 7 seconds into the bargaining, close to the end. But if you use the combination, you can push the curve out a little bit further. So the process data and the pi data are about equally useful, and the process data, and then together you do much better. And also you can make a chart like this, which basically shows the lasso logit coefficients. So those blanks are zeros, where the lasso has regularized out certain things, and you can see that a lot of it is quite intuitive. For example, this is current difference, how far apart they are at any time. And the bigger that number is, red color here means it predicts strikes. It predicts they won't agree. But you get some very interesting surprises, and you get changes of sign, like here. Like the time at which the uninformed player first changed is good for deals here and bad for deals here. Okay. All right. Final bit is human and machine learning prediction. So if you pose the question, how well are human predictions compared to statistical models? And what are interesting differences, and are there differences across experts, and blah, blah, blah. It turns out there's a long history to this question with an interesting answer. Paul Meehl, in 1954, wrote this book. He was a psychiatrist and was quite interested in quantitative methods. And he collected 22 studies in which human experts had predicted things like recidivism of criminals, schizophrenia, I think things like college admissions, credit worthiness, things where there's typically a kind of a matrix of standard variables and somebody makes a prediction. And these were actual clinical data. And he compared those to statistical models, which were typically simple OLS of regressors predicting the same outcomes. And all these things you had actual measured outcomes, which often we don't have, like whether people committed a crime, who did well after college. And as he and others put it, I thought the statistical models would be a floor, and anyone who couldn't reach the floor couldn't be considered an expert, and the experts would all be above it. But it turned out the floor is a ceiling at the individual level. So if this is some meta-analysis, this is Milton 54, this is some more recent ones. The meta-analysis all show that either statistic and clinical are about equally good. Many of these are pretty underpowered, so it's hard to find much of a difference, even if it was there. And mostly the statistical models do as well or better. And there's a rare cases where clinical are better. Okay. So there's a long history of skepticism about that, except when I was first introduced to this in the 70s and 80s, almost nobody was using statistical models except in credit scoring. And everyone objected to them. And one reason was the clinicians said, well, we have intuition. Yeah, we have intuition that's not captured in these statistics. And also there may be, Mill had this idea, there might be something like a broken leg cue, which is basically something that never happened in a training sample. So that a training sample would never give any weight to something which you knew intuitively would have a very high weight. So the idea was we have essentially priors on certain types of variables that would not get weighted correctly in small training samples. Obviously, big training samples, you may have everything. Okay. What does this tell us? I think one thing it tells us is that we do not intuitively accept sparsity. We, meaning people who are making these types of judgments. So in Dawes' paper, which is so lovely, he talks about early work on marital satisfaction. I think something similar to this is held up pretty well, which is if you measure how often people have sex versus fight per week, that correlates with marital satisfaction. Causality, probably, but who knows? In his work on graduate admissions, and by the way, a lot of this work is quite crude by modern statistical standards, which I think is forgivable, but if you read it, you'll see that. So for example, they only had a sample of people who are admitted to their own program, so they don't know who was unadmitted, what happens to them, which obviously you really would like to know. It turns out that if you just standardize these variables and just weight them equally even, or you derive weights from OLS, if you take the GRE, the quality of the undergraduate institution, and their GPA, that correlates about 0.48. Human judgments doing this at the University of Oregon is 0.19. So the human judgment has value in it, but it seems to actually just add noise largely to simple models. And Sandy Jenks has this kind of formula. If you finish high school, you have a steady job, you don't have a baby out of wedlock, you won't be poor. Okay. Most humans are obsessed with personal interviews in the sense they think there's a lot of diagnosticity, including some of you, because you, by revealed preference or belief or revealed something, revealed coercion, because we don't do this anymore. But people seem to love the idea that when you meet somebody, you can learn something about them, which is diagnostic for a criterion like, will they get tenure 6 years later, as opposed to, would I like to have a barbecue with this person, or are they interested in my research? And so Danny wrote about this. Maybe he'll talk in the discussion a bit about outside and inside view. And the outside view is essentially a clustering, right? That there's some predictive properties of, say, particular deals, and in those deals, mergers and acquisitions work well. And the inside view is that each thing is its own special cluster, okay? And the appeal of the inside view is that it doesn't throw away information. Also, the inside view invites more optimism. So if you're arguing for a marriage is great or for a job candidate, the inside view allows you more leeway. The outside view is kind of harsh and cold. Okay, almost done. So the final thing, I wish I had a little bit more technical detail, but I'm hoping to build it into the other paper, which is a lot of features of what we think are basic human judgment limits could be thought of as using machine learning incorrectly, particularly not correcting for overfitting. And I had this idea, and also Jesse Shapiro mentioned it a few months ago at a conference, so I need to give him credit on that. For example, Oskamp did a famous study in 1965 where he gave clinicians little bits of a profile and then asked questions about a person's personality. And there were multiple choice questions that had 5 answers, like is this person friendly, does they love their mother, do they have a conflicted relationship with their mother, blah, blah, blah. And so chance was 20%. The clinicians were at 26% accuracy, and as they got more and more information, up to 5 pages of information, they got up to 28%. But confidence went up linearly, literally almost linearly with each word read. Okay. And if you think about machine learning, this is exactly, the first thing is, if you're not correcting, if you're using in-sample accuracy as your criterion, you're not correcting for out-of-sample, you'll be overconfident. You'll be constantly surprised at, wow, I was really quite sure for my training sample, and oh, I was wrong. So this gap is that overconfidence gap. And as you have more and more data, the gap will grow, and that's OSGAP. Okay? So I talked about two things, which is machine learning if we're looking at 3x3 games, or at a kind of very, very broadly measured lots and lots of features of process in free-form bargaining. We might be able to discover new behavioral variables and also discover kind of what the ceiling is, how much, and if we're lucky, the ceiling might not be too far off, right? So Freudenberg and Liang get 96% of what's almost perfectly accurate prediction out of a five depth decision tree, and we get about 80% out of cognitive hierarchy from 13 years ago. And second, we can think of some aspects of human prediction, particularly overconfidence. In the paper, I talk about also limited error correction. People may not error correct the way that that machine learning does in a kind of cold, oops, I made a mistake, I need to backprop way. Thanks.
That was my conclusion from yesterday. I couldn't understand most of what was going on, and yet I had the feeling I was learning a lot. Now, I'll have some remarks about Colin and then some remarks about the few things that I noticed yesterday that I could understand. I certainly agree with Colin about, I think it's a lovely idea that if you have a mass of data and you use deep learning, you will find out much more than your theory in general. And I would hope that machine learning can be a source of hypotheses. That is, that some of these variables that you identify are genuinely interesting. At least in my field, the bar for successful publishable science is very low. We consider theories confirmed even when they explain very little of the variance, if they yield statistically significant predictions. We treat the residual variance as noise, and a deeper look into the residual variance, which machine learning is good at, is clearly an advantage. So, as an outsider, actually, I have been surprised not to hear more about that, about the superiority of AI to what people can do. Perhaps as a psychologist, this is what interests me most. Now, I'm not sure that new signals will always be interesting, but I suppose that some may lead to new theory, and that would be useful. Now, I don't really fully agree with Colin's second idea that it's useful to view human intelligence as a weak version of artificial intelligence. There are similarities, and certainly you can model some of human overconfidence in that way, but I do think that the processes that occur in human judgment are really quite different, the processes that produce overconfidence. Now, I left myself time for some remarks of my own on what I learned yesterday. And one of the recurrent issues, both in talks and in conversations, was whether AI can eventually do whatever people can do. And, will there be anything that is reserved for human beings? And frankly, I don't see any reason to set limits on what AI can do. We have in our heads, a wonderful computer. It's made of meat, but it's a computer. It's extremely noisy. It does parallel processing. It is extraordinarily efficient. But, there is no magic there. And so it's very difficult to imagine that with sufficient data, there will remain things that only humans can do. Now, the reason that we see so many limitations, I think, is that this field is really at the very beginning. I mean, we're talking of a development, deep learning that took off. I mean, the idea is old, but the development took off 8 years ago, so that's the sort of landmark date that people are mentioning. And that's nothing. You have to imagine what it might be like in 50 years. Because the one thing that I find extraordinarily surprising and interesting in what is happening in AI these days is that everything is happening faster than was expected. So people were saying that it will take 10 years for AI to beat Go. And the interesting thing is it took 8 months. So this excess of speed at which the thing is developing and accelerating, I think, is very remarkable. So setting limits is certainly premature. One point that was made yesterday was about the uniqueness of humans when it comes to evaluations. It was called judgment here. In my jargon, it's evaluation of outcomes, and basically the utility side of the decision function. And I really don't see why that should be reserved to humans. On the contrary, I mean, I'd like to make the following argument. The main characteristic of people is that they're very noisy. You show them the same stimulus twice, they don't give you the same response twice. You show the same choice twice. I mean, that's why we have stochastic choice theory, because there is so much variability in people's choices given the same stimuli. Now, what can be done with AI, it can be done even without AI, is a program that observes in an individual's choices will be better than the individual at a wide variety of things. In particular, it will make better choices for the individual because it will be noise-free. And it will, that we know from the literature that Colin cited on the literature from Meal and on predictions. There's an interesting tidbit. If you take clinicians and you have them predict some criterion a large number of times, and then you develop a simple equation that predicts not the outcome, but the clinician's judgment, that model does better in predicting the outcome than the clinician himself. That is fundamental. This is telling you that one of the major limitations on human performance is not bias, it is just noise. And I'm maybe partly responsible for this, but people now, when they talk about error, tend to think of bias as an explanation. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Well, this is a bias, and it is an error. And in fact, most of the errors that people make are better viewed as random noise. And there's an awful lot of it. And admitting the essence of noise means something. It has implications for practice. And one implication is obvious, that you should replace humans by algorithms whenever possible. And this is really happening. Even when the algorithms don't do very well, humans do so poorly and are so noisy that just by removing the noise, you can do better than people. And the other is that when you can't do it, you try to have humans simulate the algorithm. And that idea, by enforcing regularity and processes and discipline on judgment and on choice, you reduce the noise, and you improve performance, because noise is so poisonous. Now, Jan LeCun said yesterday that humans would always prefer emotional contact with other humans. That strikes me as probably wrong. It is extremely easy to develop stimuli to which people will respond emotionally. A face, an expressive face, a face that changes expressions, that will buy people, especially if it's sort of baby-shaped. I mean, you know, so there are cues that will make people feel very emotional. Robots will have these cues. Furthermore, it is already the case that AI reads faces better than people do, and undoubtedly will be able to predict emotions and development in emotions far better than people can. And I really can imagine that one of the major uses of robots will be taking care of the old. Because I can imagine that many old people will prefer to be taken care of by robots, by friendly robots that have a name, that have a personality, that are always pleasant. They will prefer that to being taken care of by their children. Now, I want to end on a story. A well-known novelist, I'm not sure he would appreciate my giving his name, wrote me some time ago that he's planning a novel. And in the novel is about a love triangle between two humans and a robot. And what he wanted to know is, how would the robot be different from the individuals? And I proposed three main differences. Now, one is obvious. The robot will be much better at statistical reasoning and less enamored with stories and narratives than people are. The other is that the robot would have much higher emotional intelligence. And the third is that the robot would be wiser. And wisdom is breadth. Wisdom is not having too narrow a view. That's the essence of wisdom. It's broad framing. And a robot will be endowed with broad framing, and I really do not see, when it has learned enough, it will be wiser than we people, because we don't have broad framing. We're narrow thinkers, we're noisy thinkers. It's very easy to improve upon us, and I don't think that there is very much that we can do that computers will not eventually be programmed to do. Thank you.
Well, Danny, I want to say that what I'm going to say may be noisy. You may be right. I hope you're not. And let me raise a few doubts. What you call noise in human choices, you relate to it as a very negative thing. Why is consistency of choices necessarily a good? I mean, perhaps, you know, what you call noise in our choices is experimentation, natural evolution. We may be evolving in terms of our preferences. You know, I myself, in the 8 in the morning, I'm not the same person at 8:30 in the morning after I had my first coffee. So, you know, why the insistence of outdoing human with the machine in terms of consistency of choices is a good, okay? So that's kind of for me, and also you said something at the beginning that I really liked, in the sense that the ML is a way of unveiling the residual, you know, opening the black box, okay? But fine, so let's have ML doing that with our nodes, but not necessarily overriding.
Well, a couple of comments. People are noisy all over. Now, you can make a case that noise in decision-making has a use, because noise has a use when there's feedback and it allows evolution and learning. Mm-hmm. But there isn't much more noise in decision-making than there is in judgment and prediction, where noise simply reduces accuracy. So noise is really a very general phenomenon. Now, your second question I've lost.
No, I said that, ML can allow us to, to understand better what the noise is all about, but not necessarily use it as in order to avoid the noise by humans. You see, these are two different issues.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's here. There's a long history, and it's the same literature that Colin was referring to about clinical and actuarial judgment. It turns out that people, individuals, they produce valuable information in the context, for example, of personnel selection. So interviews yield information that is useful. And it even doesn't duplicate other information, test information and other results. But it turns out that if you let the interviewer look at all the data and then make the final score, the final score is less useful and less valid than if there had been no interview and you had allowed the machine to do it. And the general conclusion, actually, of those studies is that the machine should have the final word. It's not people who should have the final word. There's one kind of exception. Suppose you have, a setup that predicts, loan performance, and then, of course, if you hear in the morning that the person who requested the loan has been arrested, then you won't approve the loan. That's the role for humans. This is the broken leg type of thing. But otherwise, algorithms are better, and they can and should use human judgment as input. But we shouldn't put ourselves above them because we mess it up.
Great. So we have a fantastically long list. So let's quick questions if possible. We'll go Jan, Steve, Joshua, Chad to start.
So I actually completely agree with you, Dan. I'm here in the back. Here. Actually, completely agree with you that robots will eventually be better at eliciting emotion in humans than other humans. And certainly will have a better ability at sort of decoding us or putting us in a particular state of mind better than our friends. What I said, though, yesterday is that I think we will learn to make the difference, and because human-to-human interactions will become rarer and interactions with robots will be cheap, we'll give more value to human interactions. So this is not to say that interactions with robots would be inferior. It's just that, it's the same way we're wiser and make better decisions than our dogs, but our dogs still like interacting with other dogs.
Okay. What did I say? Steve.
Very interesting. And Colin, I like the way you related ML to mistaken thinking, and that made me wonder between some of the that you presented, and I don't remember where I read it, but I'm sure you'll know where this is from. People have trouble reacting in terms of ways updating to low probability events. That people who were exposed to a low probability event think of it as being much higher probability than people who weren't exposed to it. So I wonder if there's a relationship between these broad phenomena.
I hadn't thought of that one actually, but it is true. I'm just going to echo something Danny said recently, that rare event. There's sort of two modes of thinking about rare events, which is and panic. And statistically, of course, they're very difficult too. A rare event may trigger a regime shift, which is notoriously difficult. I'm not sure. It's possible that, say, in extremely large training sets, you start to have enough rare events, the same way that say if you had a huge meeting of humans who'd suffered through various rare illnesses or catastrophes, like being hit by lightning, that group of humans could kind of aggregate their judgment in some way that wouldn't happen in a single human lifetime. So I think there's potential for optimism, but it may also be that if events are rare enough, they just get regularized out. You don't, essentially you're really afraid of overfitting. In ML, where with correction for overfitting, you're really afraid of overfitting anything that happens so rarely, and then it gets kind of dismissed, which may be one way of thinking. I mean, it's the opposite of the pattern I had in mind, that humans naturally overfit in ways that good ML doesn't. But it's an interesting idea.
Chad.
So I wanted to contribute to this game that we all play, which is, once the AI are better than us at everything, what role are people going to play in the economy? And I guess I share a little bit of Jan's view, but maybe nuanced a little bit. One example I like to look at today is chess. So machines are much better at chess than people and have been for a while now. Chess is thriving as an activity that people watch. You can watch it on the internet all around the world. People pay good money to watch it. And it seems to be things like that will probably persist even when machines are better. And so especially, I think Jan was referring to the performing arts, ballet, jazz. I'm sure machines will be able to do those things better. And yet, I think there is going to be a role for people. And that'll show up a little bit in the model of growth in AI that I present in a little bit.
So one point I wanted to bring up is, given the gap between, let's say, optimal rational human decisions and certain behavioral biases, it seems that machine learning that can identify that can oftentimes play to that gap, take advantage of that gap, and cater to our behavioral biases in ways that are suboptimal for us humans. And I would say even, for example, certain large media companies nowadays are catering to that, and probably because their artificial intelligence systems are finding that optimal, and it is not necessarily desirable for human welfare.
Yeah, just one thing, which is I intended the second part of the talk to be a sort of grant proposal that says, suppose you're a cognitive science student who's not afraid of math and likes reducing things to models and then tinkering around. There's kind of a recipe of something you could do, which is to say, read the psychology very carefully, try to think about whether the process, with Danny's skepticism held in mind, try to think of whether the elements of the psychological process could be instantiated in a statistical model, and then, make a bad version of the statistical model or an imperfect version of the statistical model. It could be memory limited. It could be top-down encoding so you miss mistakes because of confirmation bias, and then see if that reproduces human data. And it's one way of potentially moving forward. And also, one thing many of us have been thinking about is, as I mentioned, we don't want behavioral economics to be a list of effects and biases that's constantly growing the list is not the goal. Like, adding interesting information is good, but constantly dimension reducing the list is the goal. And often more effects will sometimes kind of tip to where you think, oh, wait a minute. If these three effects are accompanied by this fourth effect, then it occurs to me that they're all explained by principle X. So let's find principle X.